Before you hear this story, I want you to be honest with yourself about something. We spend our whole lives watching out for the wrong kind of danger. The loud kind, the obvious kind. The stranger at the door, the phone scam from a foreign number, the email asking for your banking password. Nobody warns you about the quiet kind. The kind that shows up at your front door with a casserole dish and a hug that lasts a second too long. Ask yourself this, and really sit with it. What would you do if the person trying to take everything from you was also the person you'd watched grow up? My name is Arthur. I'm 63 years old. I live in Knoxville, Tennessee, in a house I've owned since 1998, and I nearly lost all of it. The house, the accounts, the right to speak from my own life, because of a security camera my son-in-law gave me as a Christmas gift. I want to tell you exactly how it happened, not because I need sympathy, but because I almost didn't see it coming. And I'm not a naive man. I worked 31 years as a plant operations manager at a paper mill outside of town. If something broke, I fixed it. If something looked wrong, I found out why. I raised 2 daughters mostly on my own after my wife Carolyn passed from ovarian cancer in 2009. I balanced their tuition and my mortgage and my own grief, and I never once asked anyone for help I didn't absolutely need. I say all of this not to brag, but to explain why what happened hit me so hard. I thought I was the kind of man this couldn't happen to. I was wrong. It started at Christmas 14 months ago. My younger daughter, Becca, and her husband, Kyle, had come up from Nashville. Kyle Marsh. He'd been in the family for 6 years, and I'd never fully warmed to him. He had a way of talking that made everything sound like a presentation, always the smoothest sentence in the room. He sold commercial real estate and he was good at it, and sometimes I thought he practiced being likable in the mirror. But Becca loved him and I loved Becca, so I kept my opinions to myself. That Christmas Eve, after dinner, Kyle brought out a box with a red bow. For the house, he said, peace of mind. Inside was a wireless indoor security camera, the kind you mount in a corner and connect to your phone. Small, white, subtle. Kyle spent about 20 minutes setting it up in my living room while I watched football. He walked me through the app, showed me the little blue light that meant it was recording, explained how I could check the feed from anywhere. You're out here alone, he said, clapping me on the shoulder. Now you don't have to be. I thanked him. I meant it. I installed the app on my phone the way he showed me. For the first few weeks I checked it occasionally. Mostly I forgot it was there. It became part of the room, like the clock on the mantel or the coat rack by the door. I didn't think about it again until February, when my neighbour Phil asked me something strange. Phil Garner lives 2 houses down. We've been friends since our kids were small. He's been in IT his entire career, spent the last 10 years doing network security consulting before he retired. When we talk, I listen because Phil notices things other people don't. We were in his garage one Saturday afternoon, supposed to be watching him work on his truck, really just drinking coffee and talking the way men our age do when they finally have time to. Phil asked me if I'd got many new devices lately, smart TV, router, anything like that. I mentioned the camera. He put his coffee down. Just set it on the workbench, slow and deliberate, the way you do when you want your hands free. Who set it up? He asked. Kyle, my son-in-law. Phil looked at me for a moment, long enough that I knew something was off. Can I come take a look at it? I didn't ask why. I just said yes. Phil came over the next morning. He had a small laptop and a device I didn't recognize, and he spent about 40 minutes in my living room doing things I couldn't follow. He didn't say much while he worked. That wasn't unusual for Phil. He's a man who waits until he's sure. When he was done, he sat across from me at the kitchen table. Arthur, he said, that camera isn't only recording locally. I didn't understand what he meant at first. He explained it carefully. The camera had been configured to stream to an external account, not mine. Someone else had set up a secondary access, linked through a separate login. They had a live view into my living room any time that camera was powered on. The footage wasn't stored only on my app. It was going somewhere else. I sat very still. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed. So someone's been watching me, I said. Potentially for weeks, Phil said. Maybe longer. I looked at the camera on the wall. Same white casing, same little blue light. It hadn't changed. But the room felt different now. Like I'd been speaking into a phone I didn't know was live. Phil told me not to disconnect it. Don't change anything, he said. If they know you found it, whatever they're planning, they'll adjust. I nodded. I was already back at work in my mind, not panicking, just going quiet and methodical the way I used to when a line went down at the mill. You don't fix anything by running. You assess, you document, you find out where the problem starts. That night I sat in my bedroom and tried to think about what they could have seen. I do most of my living in that living room. I make phone calls on the couch. I talk to my accountant with papers spread out on the coffee table. My financial advisor, Robert Hicks, had been over twice in the past 2 months to go over my retirement distributions. We talked about my IRA, my pension from the mill, the life insurance policy I'd updated after Carolyn died, the equity in the house. I thought about all the numbers I'd said out loud in that room. Why? That was the question I kept coming back to. Why would Kyle want to watch me? I didn't sleep much. By morning I had a partial answer, and I didn't like it. 3 days after Phil found the secondary stream, I got a call from my older daughter Linda, who lives in Chattanooga. She said Kyle had mentioned to Becca that he was worried about me, that I seemed to be slipping. Her word, then his. What do you mean slipping? I asked. She hesitated. He said you'd been talking about your finances in a way that seemed disorganized, that you'd mentioned some accounts you apparently couldn't keep straight. I pressed my palm flat against the kitchen counter. I hadn't talked to Kyle about my finances. Not once, not ever. But I had talked to Robert in my living room. I told Linda I was fine. She believed me, I think, because she knows me. She said she'd talked to Becca about it, and Becca seemed to be going along with what Kyle was saying. But she wasn't sure Becca believed it either. She said it felt like the concern was coming from one direction. Kyle's direction, I said. She didn't disagree. After I hung up, I went to my filing cabinet. It's an old grey 2-drawer I've had since the 90s. I keep it in the spare bedroom, behind the door, the kind of thing you don't think about because it's always been there. I look through the folders the way you look through something when you're hoping not to find anything. Second drawer, back section, behind the old tax returns, a folder that wasn't mine. Inside, printed documents, typed, formal. A cover sheet that said preliminary estate planning notes in the top left corner. Below it, handwritten items in a tight slanted script I recognized. Kyle's handwriting. I stood there with the folder in my hands and read slowly. The notes described a conversation, allegedly with me, in which I had expressed confusion about my accounts, difficulty recalling recent transactions, uncertainty about my own beneficiaries. Each item had a date next to it. Every date was in the past 3 months. None of those conversations had happened. Below the notes was a draft document, power of attorney language. My name was typed in the appropriate blanks. Kyle's name was typed in the section marked designated agent. I sat down on the edge of the spare bed. The house was completely quiet. I'm 63 years old. I run a mile 3 times a week. I balance my own checkbook. I have never once confused an account number, forgotten a bill, or needed someone to walk me through paperwork. And yet here in my own filing cabinet was a manufactured record suggesting otherwise. I didn't confront anyone. I closed the folder, put it exactly where I found it, and called Phil. He listened. Then he said, "You need to call an elder law attorney today, not tomorrow." I called a lawyer named Harriet Moss that afternoon. She'd been recommended to me years ago by a colleague and I'd never needed her. She had an office in downtown Knoxville near Market Square, and she saw me the same day. Harriet was direct. She said what I was describing was a pattern she'd seen before. Financial exploitation of an older adult, even one who was perfectly capable, typically required establishing a paper trail of apparent incapacity first. Notes, observations, medical suggestions. Enough to present to a judge. "Someone's building a case," she said, "one that bypasses you entirely." I asked her what I should do. She told me to document everything, dates and details, and to not sign a single piece of paper that came from any direction related to Kyle or Becca until we'd spoken. She said she would contact the district attorney's office about the unauthorized camera access, which was a potential criminal matter under Tennessee wiretapping statutes. I drove home past the old city, past the market, past the neighborhoods I'd lived near for 30 years. I knew every corner, and I felt, for the first time in as long as I could remember, like something familiar was trying to swallow me whole. That evening I did something that made my stomach turn. I sat in the living room with the camera running and said out loud to no one that I'd been having more trouble keeping track of things lately, that maybe I needed someone to help me organize my finances going forward, that the paperwork was getting complicated. Every word tasted wrong. I waited. The next morning, Kyle called. He never called me directly. He called Becca, and Becca relayed things. But this time, it was his number. "Hey Arthur," he said. Easy, warm. "Just checking in. Becca said you've been a little overwhelmed lately. I know Robert's been by a couple times. I just want you to know, if you ever want help managing the load, I'm always willing to step in." I said I appreciated it. I kept my voice steady. After I hung up, my hands were shaking, but not from fear, from the effort of not saying what I actually thought. I told Phil what happened. He said it proved what we already knew. Kyle was listening to that feed. He'd heard me in the living room and responded within 12 hours. The next week was the hardest stretch. I went about my days. I went to the gym. I had lunch with Phil on Tuesday. I raked leaves on Thursday. All of it felt like acting, like I was performing a version of my life for an audience I couldn't see. At night, I'd sit in the bedroom, door closed, and go through everything with Harriet's framework in mind. I wrote dates in a spiral notebook, conversations I remembered, the Christmas setup, the notes in the folder, the phone calls. I wrote it all down in ink because Harriet said the same thing Phil had: paper outlasts digital when it matters. 2 things happened in the 3rd week that changed the shape of everything. The first was a call from my bank, Regions Bank, the branch on Kingston Pike, where I've had my accounts for 20 years. A woman named Carol from their Fraud and Elder Services department said that someone had called the previous week requesting information about my accounts. She said the caller identified herself as a family member assisting with account management. Carol said they hadn't released any information because no formal authorization was on file, but she was calling me as a courtesy. The caller had been Becca. I don't know how long I sat with that information before I could speak again. When I did, I asked Carol to document the call and to flag my accounts for any unauthorized access attempts. The second thing was harder. I drove to Nashville to see Becca. I didn't call ahead. I told myself it was just a visit. I parked on the street outside their house and sat in the car for probably 10 minutes watching the light in the living room window. Becca and I used to be close. She called me every Sunday when she first moved out. She'd come up for her mother's birthday every year, even after Carolyn was gone, just to sit with me and look at old pictures. I didn't know when that had stopped, but it had. I went to the door. Kyle answered. He smiled the way he always did, wide and practiced. "Arthur, hey, this is a surprise." Becca came around the corner, and the look on her face was the one I'd been dreading. Careful. Managed. The look of someone who'd been coached on what to say. I didn't go inside. I stood on the front step and looked at my daughter. "I need to know if you called the bank about my accounts," I said. She glanced at Kyle. "1 second, that was enough." "I was just trying to help," she said. "We've been worried about, did Kyle ask you to call?" Another glance. He put his hand on her shoulder. I looked at him. He met my eyes without flinching. That was the thing about Kyle. He didn't flinch. "I think we should all sit down," he said, "and have a calm conversation. I think you should tell me why there's a folder in my filing cabinet with your handwriting on it," I said. The smile stayed in place, but something behind it shifted, just slightly, like a door that didn't quite close. Becca's mouth opened. "We're trying to protect you," Kyle said. "From what?" He had an answer ready. He talked about my age, about the complexity of retirement assets, about what happened to people who didn't plan ahead. He mentioned Carolyn's illness and how it had left me isolated. He mentioned that I'd been acting differently since last spring. He had a story for everything, careful and rehearsed, and the worst part was that it almost sounded reasonable. Almost. "You connected that camera to your account," I said. He stopped. "Phil found the secondary stream," I said. "In February." 3 seconds of silence. I counted them. "That's not," he started. "I have documentation," I said. "The camera configuration, the call to the bank, the folder. Harriet Moss has copies of all of it." Becca made a sound I won't describe. It wasn't dramatic. It was small. The sound of something settling. Kyle took his hand off her shoulder. I looked at my daughter. I wanted to be angry at her. I'd been carrying it for 2 weeks. But standing there on that step, in the cold Nashville evening with the streetlights coming on, I mostly just felt tired and sad for her, and sad for whatever had gotten into her marriage that made her go along with this. "I'm not signing anything," I said. "I'm not confused. I'm not declining, and the next call to my bank from anyone connected to you will go directly to the DA's office." I turned around and walked back to my car. I drove home in the dark, past the I-40 interchange, past the rest stops and the tree lines and the long quiet stretches of Tennessee Highway, and I didn't turn the radio on. The weeks after that moved differently. Harriet moved forward with a formal complaint to the district attorney's office regarding unauthorized surveillance under Tennessee wiretapping law. The camera configuration data, exported by Phil and signed off on by a certified forensic technologist he knew from his consulting days, was submitted as supporting documentation. The Elder Financial Exploitation Unit at the Knox County DA's office opened a formal review. I didn't hear from Kyle. Becca called once, 2 weeks later. She was crying. She said she hadn't understood the full scope of what he was doing, that she'd trusted him, that she believed him when he said the camera was for my safety, and that the bank call was a formality. I believed her, partly. I think Becca wanted to believe the story Kyle gave her because the alternative was harder to sit with, that her husband had looked at her father and seen something to take. We talked for a long time. I didn't forgive her that night, but I didn't close the door either. At our age, you learn that forgiveness isn't a single moment. It's a direction you decide to move in or not, and you don't have to decide right away. I had the camera removed the same week Phil identified the stream. I went back to the motion sensor porch light I'd had for 15 years. It doesn't watch me through a secondary login. It just comes on when something moves outside the way it's supposed to. I updated my will. I updated my beneficiaries. I met with Robert Hicks again, in his office this time, not my living room, and we restructured a few things so that any changes to my accounts require in-person verification with my banker, Carol, who'd flagged the unauthorized call in the first place. I also called Linda and told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is more than most people can do with a story like this. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "I always thought something was off with him," she said. "You and me both," I said. "Phil and I still have coffee on Saturday mornings. He doesn't say I told you so because he's not that kind of man. But every now and then he'll shake his head at something on the news about elder financial abuse and say, they count on people not paying attention. I pay attention now in a different way than I used to. I always thought paying attention meant watching the front door. I've learned it means watching the room you're already standing in. I'm 63. I still run my mile. I still balance my own checkbook. I still know what I own and what I've earned and what my name means on a piece of paper. I came close to having that taken away, not by force, not by a stranger, but by a man who smiled when he shook my hand and spent 6 years learning how to seem trustworthy. The lesson I'll leave you with isn't about technology. It isn't even really about security cameras. It's about what happens when someone decides that you are worth more to them as a problem to manage than as a person to respect. That can come from anywhere. It can come wrapped in concern. It can come with a bow on it at Christmas. The only defense I know is this: know what you have, know what you've signed, and never let someone else's urgency become your reason to move faster than you're comfortable with. If something feels off, slow down. Ask questions. Write things down. Call someone you trust who has no stake in the outcome. Protecting yourself is not paranoia. It is not weakness. At 63, at 70, at any age, Your life and your name and your peace are yours. Nobody gets to take them from you with paperwork and a rehearsed smile. Thank you for listening to this. If any part of it reminded you of something in your own life or someone you love, please don't keep it to yourself. Share it. These things survive in silence and fall apart in the light. I'm Arthur, and this is Voices of Uncle Edmund. I still think about the moment I found that folder, standing in the spare bedroom, the one that still smells faintly like the cedar blocks Carolyn used to put in the closet. Kyle's handwriting on those pages. Dates that never happened. Conversations I never had. A version of me that existed only on paper, confused and incapable, invented to make way for someone else's signature. What strikes me now, more than the anger ever did, is the cause and effect of it all. Kyle didn't start out planning something criminal. I believe that actually. I think he looked at a 63-year-old man living alone in a paid-off house with a pension and a retirement account, and he made a quiet calculation. He decided my future was an opportunity. And then, one small step at a time, each one just barely justifiable on its own, he built a machine to take it. The camera was one piece. The notes were another. The call to the bank. The planted concern about my memory. None of it would have held up alone. Together, it almost worked. That's how these things happen. Not with one dramatic moment of evil, but with patience and incrementalism and the assumption that the person being targeted won't look closely enough. Kyle counted on me being trusting. He was right that I was trusting. He was wrong that trust and awareness can't coexist. Phil is the reason I'm telling this story instead of living a different one. Not because Phil is exceptional, but because he paid attention. He set his coffee down and asked a question. That's it. That one act of intellectual honesty, the willingness to look at something uncomfortable and name it clearly, changed everything. I've thought a lot about that, about how much of what goes wrong in people's lives could be interrupted by someone simply being willing to say what they're actually seeing. I had to develop that same quality in myself. I had to stop wanting the comfortable explanation. Stop hoping that the folder in my cabinet meant something innocent. Stop giving Kyle the benefit of a doubt he hadn't earned. That took more effort than I expected. It is genuinely hard to let go of the story where the people close to you mean you well. But clarity, the real kind, requires you to look at what's actually in front of you rather than what you wish was there. And then there was the part that nobody talks about much. The weeks of sitting with it, of going to the gym and fixing dinner and raking leaves while carrying something heavy that I couldn't put down and couldn't share. That required a kind of endurance I hadn't asked for. I didn't fall apart. I documented. I called Harriet. I wrote things down in ink. I drove to Nashville and stood on that front step and said the true thing out loud even though my hands were unsteady. That steadiness, the kind you have to build deliberately, wasn't about being tough in some performance sense. It was about deciding that my life was worth the discomfort of protecting it, that I wasn't going to hand it over because someone had manufactured enough paperwork to make me doubt myself. Arthur, my neighbour Phil would say if you asked him what happened. Arthur paid attention. That's what I want to leave with anyone listening to this. Not a warning to distrust everyone you love, but a reminder that paying attention is an act of self-respect, that the right question asked at the right moment can protect everything, and that when it comes to your name, your accounts, your home, and your right to speak for yourself, the most important thing you can do is stay present and refuse to disappear quietly.